The air was heavy with the faint smell of rain, the kind that lingered long after a summer storm had passed. A soft breeze rustled through the trees lining the cracked pavement of the old neighborhood. Once a vibrant community, the area now bore the scars of neglect, faded storefronts, abandoned cars and streetlights that flickered erratically. Despite its current state, for Senator Layla Carter, this place held memories too vivid to ignore. She had grown up here, running along these very streets as a child, dreaming of a world where justice wasn't an elusive concept, but a right accessible to everyone. Now, as a respected senator, she was working tirelessly to make that dream a reality, though she never imagined how much resistance it would provoke. Layla had spent the evening visiting her father, a stoic and proud Vietnam War veteran who refused to leave his modest home in this neighborhood, despite her repeated offers to move him somewhere safer. "I built my life here, Layla," he would say with quiet conviction, his deep-set eyes unwavering. "If I leave, I give them permission to take the rest of it." She understood his sentiment all too well. It was the same unyielding spirit that had driven her to become a leading figure in the fight for police reform and effort that earned her both widespread admiration and bitter enemies. As Layla walked alongside her two children, Amara, an inquisitive 8-year-old with her mother's sharp gaze, and Jalen, a protective 10-year-old wise beyond his years, she felt a rare moment of peace. The kids had begged her to let them stop at the small park they used to visit when they were younger. Despite her initial hesitation, this neighborhood was far from safe at night. Layla relented. She wanted them to feel the same connection to these streets that had shaped her, even if just for a fleeting moment. They deserved to know their roots, and she deserved a moment of respite from the unrelenting demands of her role. The park was eerily quiet, with only the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional chirp of crickets breaking the silence. The playground equipment, though rusted and worn, still stood as a testament to the neighborhood's former vitality. Amara and Jalen raced ahead, their laughter cutting through the stillness as they clambered onto the swings. Layla lingered a few steps behind, her eyes scanning the perimeter out of habit. Years of being a public figure had taught her to always remain vigilant, especially in places where her name and reputation carried weight. As she settled onto a weathered bench to watch her children, Layla's thoughts began to drift. The past few months had been a whirlwind: hearings, press conferences, and countless hours spent drafting legislation aimed at dismantling systemic injustice. Her latest proposal, a sweeping police accountability bill, had sparked outrage among some law enforcement circles. Death threats had become a regular occurrence, but Layla refused to be intimidated. She had faced worse battles growing up here, where survival often depended on resilience and wit. The memories of those days fueled her resolve even now. But tonight wasn't about politics or reform. Tonight was about being a mother, about giving her children a glimpse of the world that had shaped her into the person she was today. She watched Amara and Jalen with a small smile, their carefree energy momentarily lifting the weight on her shoulders. They were the reason she fought so hard, the reason she couldn't afford to give up, no matter how exhausting the fight became. Across the street, hidden in the shadows of a dimly lit alley, Officer Derek White sat in his patrol car, his fingers drumming impatiently against the steering wheel. The radio on his dashboard crackled occasionally, spitting out routine dispatch updates, but Derek barely paid attention. His shift had been uneventful, a monotonous stretch of patrolling streets he had long since deemed unworthy of his time. To him, this neighborhood was a lost cause, a breeding ground for crime and chaos that no amount of effort could salvage. He hated being assigned here, resenting every moment spent in these crumbling streets. Derek's eyes narrowed as he caught sight of movement in the park. A lone woman sat on a bench, her posture calm and unassuming. Two children played nearby, their laughter faint but audible. Something about the scene unsettled him. It wasn't unusual for people to linger in the park, even at this hour. But there was something about this woman, her composed demeanor, her confident posture that didn't sit right with him. She didn't fit his preconceived notions of who belonged here. Instinctively, Derek reached for the small drone perched on the passenger seat beside him. A recent addition to the department's patrol arsenal, the drone allowed officers to monitor areas without direct engagement. Derek had taken a liking to the device, finding satisfaction in the power it gave him to observe without being seen. He powered it up and guided it into the air, the faint hum of its rotors barely audible as it ascended. From his vantage point, the drone's camera captured a clear view of the woman and her children. Derek zoomed in, scrutinizing their every move. The woman reached into her bag, pulling out a bottle of water and handing it to one of the kids. Derek's mind raced, jumping to conclusions born out of years of prejudice and unchecked authority. Was she hiding something? Drugs, perhaps? He had no evidence, only a vague sense of suspicion that quickly morphed into certainty. He radioed in his location, framing it as a routine check, though his true intentions were far from routine. Unit 12, I've got a suspicious individual at the park on 5th and Jefferson. Requesting backup, Derek said, his tone clipped and professional. He didn't mention the children. To him, they were merely collateral in whatever scheme he imagined the woman was running. Lila noticed the faint whir of the drone overhead and looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. She had dealt with these surveillance tactics before, though they were usually deployed during protests or rallies, not quiet nights in the park. Her instincts prickled with unease, but she kept her expression neutral. The last thing she wanted was to alarm the children or escalate a situation that might not even exist. Still, her grip on her phone tightened, a reflexive act of preparation. The peace of the evening was beginning to unravel, replaced by a growing tension that Layla could feel in her chest. She rose from the bench, calling out to her children. "Amara, Jalen, time to go," she said, her voice steady but firm. The children groaned in protest, but the look in their mother's eyes silenced them. They began gathering their things, their laughter fading into an uneasy quiet. Derek watched the scene unfold through the drone's camera, his irritation mounting. She was leaving. He couldn't let that happen, not before he had a chance to assert control, to prove his suspicions right. He abandoned the drone controls and stepped out of his patrol car, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. The heavy thud of his boots against the pavement echoed in the stillness as he crossed the street, his eyes locked on the woman who was now ushering her children toward the park's exit. Lila turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, her eyes meeting Derek's. In that moment, she recognized the look in his eyes, a toxic mix of authority and prejudice that she had encountered too many times before. She squared her shoulders, bracing herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. And so the quiet evening shattered, giving way to a storm neither of them could have foreseen. Layla Carter tightened her grip on Jalen's small hand as she led her children toward the park exit. The faint crunch of gravel underfoot mixed with the rhythmic creak of the rusty swings swaying in the breeze. Though she tried to mask her growing unease, her heart was pounding. The sudden appearance of the drone, and now the deliberate sound of approaching footsteps, were enough to confirm her suspicions. This wasn't a coincidence. Years of advocacy, standing at the forefront of heated debates about police reform, had taught her to recognize the signs of escalating tension before it erupted. Tonight was no different. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. It wasn't a polite request, It was an order wrapped in thinly veiled hostility. Layla stopped in her tracks, her body instinctively shielding Amara and Jalen. She turned to face the source of the voice, and there he was, Officer Derek White, his towering frame outlined by the dim glow of the streetlights behind him. His hand rested on the grip of his holstered firearm, not drawn but close enough to send a message. His eyes, cold and assessing, were already scanning her from head to toe, making snap judgments he clearly believed to be accurate. "Yes, officer." Leela responded evenly, her voice calm but firm. She had dealt with men like him before, ones who mistook her composed demeanor for weakness. She knew better than to show fear. Fear was fuel to men like Derek. "Mind telling me what you're doing here at this hour?" Derek asked, his tone laced with suspicion. He took a step closer, his posture rigid, exuding authority he assumed would go unquestioned. Lila raised an eyebrow, refusing to move. "I'm walking with my children," she replied, her words measured. "We just visited my father." "This is a public park, isn't it?" Derek didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked to Jalin, who was clutching the small handheld recorder, his fingers wrapped tightly around it, as though it were a lifeline. Derek's gaze lingered, narrowing slightly before returning to Layla. He could feel his irritation growing. Something about her defiance, her unwillingness to cower, grated on him. "Do you live around here?" he pressed, his voice louder now, drawing attention from the shadows. "Yes, not that it's any of your concern," Layla shot back. Her calm was still intact, but her patience was wearing thin. She instinctively stepped in front of her children, blocking Derek's view of them. "Is there a problem, officer?" Derek's lips curled into a faint smirk, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You seem awfully defensive for someone who claims there's no problem," he said, his tone needling. "People don't usually hang around here at night unless they've got something to hide, especially not someone like you." The weight of his insinuation hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Amara clutched the hem of her mother's coat, her small voice trembling as she whispered, "Mama, can we go home now?" Jalen, on the other hand, held his ground, his eyes locked on Derek with a mixture of fear and defiance that only a child could manage. Lila placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder, but didn't break eye contact with the officer. "We were just leaving," she said firmly. "There's no need for this." But Derek wasn't done. His gaze drifted again to Jalen's recorder, and his smirk widened into something more sinister. "What's that you've got there, kid?" he asked, tilting his chin toward the device. "Mind if I take a look?" Jalen instinctively took a step back, clutching the recorder tighter against his chest. "It's mine," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. Derek's expression hardened. "Hand it over," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. He took another step forward, his imposing figure looming over the boy. Lila's protective instincts kicked into overdrive. She placed herself squarely between Derek and her son, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Absolutely not. You have no right to take anything from my child without cause." Derek's eyes flickered with a flash of annoyance, and he straightened, adjusting his belt as though preparing to assert his dominance. "You're awfully quick to jump to conclusions, Mom," he said mockingly. "I just need to make sure there's nothing suspicious on that device. For all I know, it could be used to." "To what?" Layla interrupted, her voice cutting through his words like a blade. "Record evidence." "Is that what you're afraid of, officer?" The subtle accusation hit its mark. Derek's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing against the grip of his holster. He hadn't anticipated this level of resistance, especially not from a woman he assumed to be out of her element. But there was something in her eyes, a quiet, unshakable confidence that unsettled him. He couldn't place it, but it made him angry. People like her were supposed to know their place, to fall in line, and yet here she was, challenging him. "Step aside, Mom," he barked, his patience thinning. "Now." Lila didn't budge. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "You've given me no reason for this harassment, and unless you can articulate one, we're leaving." Derek's frustration boiled over. He stepped closer, his voice dropping into a low, menacing growl. "You don't get to decide when this conversation is over. I do. Now step aside, or I'll make you." For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Layla could feel Amara trembling behind her, could hear Jalen's rapid breathing as he clutched the recorder like a lifeline. She wanted to scream, to fight, but she knew that any sudden move could escalate the situation beyond control. Then, in a voice steadier than she thought possible, she said, "I know my rights, officer. And so do you. If you lay a hand on me or my children without cause, you'll regret it." Derek froze, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized her. The way she spoke, the way she carried herself, it was all wrong. She wasn't just some woman walking her kids through a park at night. There was something more to her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, and that infuriated him. "What's your name?" he demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. Lila tilted her head slightly, a faint smirk playing at the corners of her lips despite the tension. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied cryptically. Derek's temper flared. "Enough of this," he snapped. He reached out, his hand brushing against her arm as he tried to shove past her toward Jalen. The boy yelped, stepping back instinctively, and Amara began to cry, the sound cutting through the night like a siren. Lila yanked her arm free, her voice rising as she said, "That's enough, officer. Don't you dare touch my son." The sharpness of her tone, combined with the growing commotion, seemed to catch Derek off guard. He hesitated, his gaze darting between the woman and the children. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. But it was too late. The line had been crossed, and Layla knew there was no turning back. Her grip tightened on Jalen's shoulder as she squared her stance, her eyes blazing with determination. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your career," she said quietly, her voice dripping with conviction. And for the first time, Derek felt a sliver of unease creep down his spine. The moment hung heavy in the air, the weight of Derek White's miscalculated aggression palpable as his hand hovered just inches away from Layla Carter. His confidence, so smug and unshakable a moment ago, now flickered with a shadow of doubt. He didn't know what it was about this woman, her sharp, unwavering gaze, her commanding tone, or her refusal to fold under his intimidation, but it unnerved him. And that made him angry. Men like Derek thrived on control, on the knowledge that a badge and a uniform gave them the power to bend others to their will. Yet here she was, standing firm, not with violence or panic, but with a composure that made him feel exposed, vulnerable even. "Ma'am," Derek growled through clenched teeth, his temper rising again. "I'm not going to ask you again. Step aside. Now." Lila stood her ground, her body angled protectively in front of Jalen and Amara, whose soft cries now mixed with the gentle rustling of the leaves overhead. She was acutely aware of every detail of the scene, the erratic flicker of the broken streetlight nearby, the faint hum of Derek's abandoned drone still hovering somewhere above them, and the distant murmur of footsteps as passers-by hurriedly retreated, unwilling to get involved. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a test of her endurance, her principles, and her resolve to protect her children without escalating the already volatile situation. "Officer," she began, her voice calm but edged with steel, "you've overstepped your bounds." You've harassed my family without cause and now you've put your hands on me. I suggest you reconsider whatever it is you're about to do next, because I promise you it won't end well." Derek's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he squared his shoulders. The authority in her tone only stoked his anger further. He couldn't back down now, not in front of her, and certainly not in front of the two children staring up at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. This wasn't just about enforcing the law anymore, it was about proving something, to her and to himself. "Is that a threat?" he spat, stepping closer, his boots crunching against the gravel with deliberate menace. "No," Layla replied evenly. "It's a fact." That was it. The last straw. Derek's hand shot forward, grabbing the recorder from Jalen's small hands before Layla could stop him. The boy cried out in alarm, and Amara let out a panicked wail, clinging to her mother's leg as Derek held the device aloft, examining it with a smirk of triumph. "What's this, huh?" he said, his tone mockingly curious. "Evidence of something you don't want me to see? Let's find out." Layla's heart pounded as she watched him fumble with the recorder, his thick fingers struggling to figure out how to operate it. She couldn't let him get away with this, not only because it was an egregious abuse of power, but because she knew what was on that device. Among Jalen's innocent recordings of his grandfather's stories was a critical snippet of audio from weeks earlier, a recording that captured Derek himself in a compromising situation. It wasn't intentional. Jalen had simply been testing the recorder in the background while they walked home one evening, but the audio was damning nonetheless. It revealed Derek and a group of officers discussing ways to bury complaints of police brutality, their casual disregard for accountability chillingly clear. "Give that back," Jalen shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. He stepped forward, but Layla quickly held him back, her hand pressing against his chest. "Jalen," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Derek. "I'll handle this." "Oh, you'll handle this, will you?" Derek sneered, finally figuring out how to play the audio. His smirk faltered as the recording began to play, the unmistakable sound of his own voice crackling through the small speaker. "We'll write it up as resisting arrest. Nobody's going to question it, these people never do." The color drained from Derek's face as the words hung in the air, his own voice incriminating him in ways he hadn't anticipated. For a moment he froze, his mind racing as he realized the implications of what he had just revealed, not only to the woman in front of him, but to anyone who might hear it later. He quickly stopped the recording, his movements jerky, almost frantic. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice rising with panic. "Where did you get this?" Layla didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was written all over his face, in the way his bravado had crumbled into desperation. But Derek wasn't the type to go down quietly. He clenched the recorder in his fist, his knuckles white, as he glared at her with a venomous intensity. "This doesn't prove anything," he snarled, his tone defensive. "You think you're smart, don't you? I think you've got me cornered." He took a threatening step forward, towering over her. "Well, let me tell you something, lady. People like me don't go down because of people like you." Layla didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her spine, her chin lifting ever so slightly as she met his gaze with unshakable resolve. "That's where you're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "People like you go down every day. It just takes someone willing to stand up to you." For a moment, Derek didn't respond. He stared at her, his face a mask of barely contained fury, before turning his attention back to the recorder. He raised it high above his head as if to smash it to the ground, but before he could act, another voice cut through the tense silence. "White, what the hell are you doing?" Derek spun around, startled, to see two additional officers approaching from the edge of the park. One of them, a younger man with a look of confusion and concern, hurried toward them, his hand resting cautiously on the radio at his shoulder. The other officer, older and more seasoned, hung back, his expression unreadable as he assessed the situation. "This doesn't concern you, Daniels," Derek snapped, his tone defensive. "I've got it under control." "Doesn't look like it," Daniels replied, his gaze flickering between Derek, Lila, and the two frightened children clinging to her. "What's going on here?" "Nothing that requires your input," Derek shot back. "This woman is interfering with an investigation and I'm handling it." Lila seized the opportunity, her voice cutting through Derek's weak justification like a blade. "This investigation is nothing more than harassment," she said, her tone measured but firm. "And now he's trying to destroy evidence that implicates him in misconduct." Daniel's brow furrowed, and he looked at Derek with growing suspicion. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Derek bristled, his posture stiffening as he tried to regain control of the situation. "She's lying," he insisted, though the crack in his voice betrayed his nerves. "She's just trying to cause trouble." "Then why do her kids look terrified?" Daniels countered, gesturing toward Amara and Jalan, who were now peeking out from behind their mother with wide, tear-filled eyes. "And what's in your hand, White?" Derek hesitated, his grip on the recorder tightening. He knew he was losing control, and the realization only fueled his desperation. But before he could respond, the older officer finally stepped forward, his calm, authoritative voice breaking through the chaos. "White, hand it over," he said simply. "What?" Derek barked, his head snapping toward the older man. "Are you serious?" "Now," the officer repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Derek's hand trembled as he slowly lowered the recorder, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Reluctantly, he placed it in the older officer's outstretched hand, his face a mask of barely concealed rage. Lila exhaled quietly, her heart still pounding as the tension in the air began to dissipate. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. She straightened her shoulders, her gaze never wavering as she prepared for the next move. Whatever came next, she would be ready. The air was thick with tension, suffocating and electric, as Officer Derek White stepped back, his fists clenched and his chest heaving. His loss of control was palpable. The other officers, Daniels, the younger of the two, and Sergeant Holloway, an older, more experienced man, stood with a quiet but unmistakable authority. They weren't buying Derek's flimsy explanations. The park, once so tranquil, now felt like the stage for an invisible battle of wills. And at the center of it all stood Layla Carter, a wall of calm in the storm, her hands resting protectively on the shoulders of her children. Sergeant Holloway turned the recorder over in his hands, his expression unreadable. Derek shifted uneasily, his bravado faltering as the sergeant pressed a button and the device crackled to life. "We'll write it up as resisting arrest. Nobody's going to question it, these people never do." Holloway's brow furrowed as the incriminating words echoed through the still night air. Daniel's jaw tightened, and his gaze snapped to Derek, his confusion giving way to disgust. Derek opened his mouth to protest, but Holloway silenced him with a single raised hand. "Not another word, White," Holloway said, his tone low and deadly. "You've done enough." Derek's face turned crimson, his fury barely contained. "You're just going to take her word for it," he snarled, gesturing toward Layla. "She's trying to set me up." Lila met his glare head-on, her expression one of measured defiance. She knew better than to speak now. The audio was damning enough, there was no need to add fuel to the fire. Instead, she tightened her grip on Jalan and Amara, silently reassuring them that everything would be okay. But in her heart, she wasn't so sure. Men like Derek White didn't go down easily, and she knew there was still a long way to go before this confrontation was over. Holloway slipped the recorder into his pocket, his sharp eyes locking onto Derek. "You're coming dangerously close to obstruction, White. Don't make this worse for yourself." But Derek wasn't listening. His gaze darted to the children, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "You really think this is over?" he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think some amateur recording is enough to take me down?" Jalen, emboldened by his mother's presence, stepped forward despite Layla's protective hand on his shoulder. His voice was shaky but determined as he said, "It's not just the recording. We saw what you did." Derek froze, his smile evaporating as his eyes narrowed at the boy. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice a dangerous growl. "You heard me," Jalen replied, his small chest puffing up with courage. "We saw you beat that man in the alley last week. You thought no one was watching, but we were. And we're not afraid to tell." Amara clung to her mother's leg, her wide eyes brimming with tears, but she nodded in agreement. "We saw everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. The words hit Derek like a freight train. His face twisted into a mask of rage and panic as he took a menacing step toward the children. "You little..." "Enough." Layla's voice cut through the night like a blade. She stepped in front of her children, her hand raised to block Derek's advance. Her composure was gone, replaced by a fiery anger that burned brighter than the streetlights. "You will not lay a hand on my kids." Holloway moved swiftly, stepping between Derek and the family. "Back off, White," he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. "Now." For a moment it seemed like Derek might lash out anyway, but the weight of Holloway's authority and the watchful gaze of Daniels held him back. He took a step back, his chest heaving and his eyes wild with frustration. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "Not by a long shot." Holloway turned to Layla, his expression softening slightly. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I need you and your children to stay here while we sort this out. I promise you, we'll get to the bottom of this." Layla's gaze hardened. "I'm not leaving until I know we're safe," she said firmly. "And until I know he's not walking away from this." Daniels stepped forward, his voice hesitant but sincere. "Ma'am, I understand your concern," he said, "but we need to handle this by the book. If you leave now, it could complicate things." Layla hesitated. She didn't trust these men, not entirely, but she also knew that staying could put her children in further danger. She glanced down at Jalen and Amara, their frightened faces breaking her heart. With a heavy sigh, she nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "But I'm not going far." Holloway nodded in understanding. "Daniels, take them to the squad car," he said. "Keep them safe." Daniels hesitated, glancing at Derek, who was now pacing like a caged animal. "What about him?" he asked. "I'll handle White," Holloway replied. "Just do as I say." Reluctantly, Daniels led Layla and her children toward the squad car parked at the edge of the park. Layla kept her arms wrapped around her kids, whispering words of comfort as they walked. But her mind was racing. She didn't trust that this was over. Derek White was a dangerous man, and she knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. As they reached the car, Daniels opened the back door and gestured for them to get in. "I'll stay here with you," he said, his voice gentle. "You're safe now." Layla didn't respond. She just nodded, pulling her children close as they climbed into the car. But her eyes remained fixed on the park, where Derek and Holloway were locked in a tense standoff. Back in the park, Derek's panic had boiled over into fury. "You're really going to take their word over mine?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You've known me for years, Holloway. You know I'm not some corrupt cop." Holloway's expression didn't waver. "I also know when someone's lying to my face," he said coolly. "And right now, that's exactly what you're doing." Derek's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This is a setup," he growled. "She's trying to frame me. You're just going to let her get away with it?" "I'm going to let the evidence speak for itself," Holloway replied. "And right now, the evidence isn't looking good for you." Derek let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you?" he said. "She's one of them. She's part of this whole movement to destroy guys like us. You think this is about justice. It's about power. And she's playing you for a fool." Holloway's eyes narrowed. "You're the only one playing games here, White," he said sharply. "And they're about to cost you everything." Derek's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked like he might lunge at Holloway. But instead he turned on his heel and stalked away, his boots crunching against the gravel as he disappeared into the shadows. Holloway let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He glanced toward the squad car, where Layla and her children sat huddled together. For the first time that night, he felt a glimmer of hope that justice might actually prevail. But as he turned back toward the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Derek White was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him more dangerous than ever. The squad car felt claustrophobic as Layla Carter sat with her children, her arms wrapped tightly around Amara and Jalin. The children were quiet now, though their eyes darted nervously between their mother and the shadowy park beyond the car's windows. The night had grown darker, the air thick with unspoken tension. The distant hum of police radios and faint crackle of static from Officer Daniel's shoulder unit were the only sounds breaking the uneasy silence. Lila's heart was racing. She could feel the sweat on her palms as her mind ran through every possible outcome of the night's events. Derek White was more dangerous than she'd initially realized. His desperation was palpable, and she knew from years of advocating for justice reform that desperate men with power were the most unpredictable. Daniel stood by the open car door, his posture stiff and his eyes scanning the park nervously. Lila watched him closely, noting the tension in his jaw and the slight tremor in his hands. He was young, barely out of his academy training, and the weight of the situation was clearly bearing down on him. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him, caught between doing what was right and the unspoken code of loyalty among officers. "Officer Daniels," Lila said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. The young man flinched slightly, turning to meet her gaze. "Are we safe here?" Daniels hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the park where Holloway and White had been left alone. "You're safe," he said, though the lack of conviction in his tone did little to reassure her. "Are we?" Layla pressed, her voice firmer now. "Because I don't believe that man will let this go. He's cornered, and cornered men don't make rational decisions." Daniels swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "Sergeant Holloway knows how to handle him," he said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. Before Layla could respond, a sudden crash echoed from the direction of the park. Her head snapped toward the sound, and she saw Holloway stumbling backward, his hand pressed to his temple. Derek White stood a few feet away, his face twisted with rage and a heavy branch clutched in his hand. The sergeant staggered but didn't fall, his other hand instinctively reaching for his radio. "Stay here," Daniels barked, slamming the car door shut and sprinting toward the park. Lila's heart leapt into her throat as she watched him disappear into the shadows. The car's interior suddenly felt suffocating, the walls closing in as her children clung to her, their small bodies trembling with fear. "What's happening, Mama?" Jalen asked, his voice quivering. "Stay calm," Layla whispered, forcing a steadiness into her voice that she didn't feel. "It's going to be okay." But she wasn't sure it would be. In the park, the scene was unraveling rapidly. Holloway had regained his balance, and was now facing Derek, his hand hovering near his holster but not yet drawing his weapon. Daniels approached cautiously, his own hand on his radio, ready to call for backup if necessary. "White, stand down." Holloway barked, his voice filled with authority. Blood trickled down his temple where the branch had struck him, but his stance remained firm. Derek's grip on the branch tightened, his knuckles white. "You think I'm just going to let this happen?" he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and panic. "You think I'm going to let her ruin my life with her lies?" "No one's lying but you," Holloway shot back. "You've dug your own grave, White. Don't make it worse." Derek let out a bitter laugh, his eyes darting between Holloway and Daniels. "You're just like the rest of them," he spat. "Traitors. Cowards. You'd sell out your own to protect people who don't deserve it." "Drop the branch, White," Daniels said cautiously, his voice trembling slightly. "Don't make this harder than it already is." But Derek wasn't listening. His gaze shifted toward the squad car at the edge of the park, where Layla and her children were watching from behind the glass. His eyes darkened with a dangerous resolve. "You don't get it, do you?" Derek said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "She's not walking away from this. None of them are." And then he moved. Lila saw him coming before Daniels or Holloway could react. Derek dropped the branch and sprinted toward the squad car, his heavy boots pounding against the pavement. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she realized his target wasn't her, it was Jalen. "Stay down," Layla commanded, pushing her children to the floor of the car as Derek reached the door and yanked at the handle. The car was locked, but the violent shaking of the door sent a jolt of terror through her body. "Open the door," Derek bellowed, slamming his fist against the window. "Open it or I swear." He didn't get to finish his sentence. Holloway tackled him from behind, the two men hitting the ground with a bone-jarring thud. Derek thrashed and roared, his fists flying as he fought to free himself. Holloway struggled to pin him down, his voice strained as he shouted, "Daniels, cuffs." Daniels was frozen for a split second, his eyes wide with shock. Then he sprang into action, racing to Holloway's side and pulling out his handcuffs. Together they managed to wrestle Derek's arms behind his back, securing him with a metallic click. "You're done, White," Holloway growled, panting heavily as he hauled Derek to his feet. "You're done." But Derek didn't stop fighting. He twisted against the cuffs, his face red with exertion and fury. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice venomous. "You think she's won?" Holloway shoved him toward Daniels, who grabbed his arm and began leading him toward the second patrol car. "Get him out of here," Holloway ordered, his voice laced with exhaustion. "I don't want to see his face again." Lila exhaled shakily as she watched Derek being dragged away, his shouts fading into the distance. She reached for the door handle, unlocking the car and stepping out into the cool night air. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall. Holloway approached her, his expression grim but slightly softer than before. "Are you all right?" he asked. Lila nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "We're fine," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "But this can't just be swept under the rug." "It won't be," Holloway assured her. "I'll make sure of it." But Layla wasn't convinced. She knew how the system worked, how it protected its own even in the face of overwhelming evidence. If she wanted justice, she would have to fight for it herself. She glanced down at Jalen and Amara, who had climbed out of the car and were now standing by her side. Jalen's eyes were fierce, his small hands clenched into fists, while Amara clung to her arm, her face buried against her sleeve. "You were brave tonight," Layla said softly, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke to her children. Braver than I could have ever asked you to be. Jalen looked up at her, his expression solemn. He's a bad man, he said simply. He shouldn't be allowed to hurt people anymore. Layla nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. He won't, she promised. Not after tonight. As she looked back toward the park, now eerily quiet once again, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about Derek White. This was about every corrupt officer who thought they could operate above the law, about every family that had suffered in silence because they didn't have the means to fight back. Tonight had been a battle, but the war was far from over, and Layla Carter was ready for it. The tension in the air had shifted. Though Derek White was restrained, the chaotic energy he left behind still lingered, coiling around the park like a serpent. Layla Carter stood outside the squad car, holding Jalen and Amara close, her mind racing. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Men like Derek didn't give up that easily, and the system that enabled him was an even bigger threat. Sergeant Holloway approached cautiously, his face stern but tinged with something that looked like regret. He's being transported to the station, he said, nodding toward the second patrol car where Daniels had just loaded Derek. We'll book him for assault, resisting arrest and harassment. But I need to know, Mom, are you ready to make this official? Layla's eyes narrowed. You think I'd walk away from this? She asked, her voice steady but cutting. This isn't just about tonight, Sergeant. This is about everything Derek White and men like him have done to people who don't have the privilege or platform to fight back. I won't let this slide. Holloway nodded, his jaw tightening. Good, but you should know this is going to get ugly. White has connections, and he's going to use every one of them to fight this. Let him try, Layla replied without hesitation. I've faced worse. Inside the second patrol car, Derek sat hunched in the back seat, his wrists cuffed tightly behind him. His breathing was ragged, and his face was flushed with fury. Daniels sat in the driver's seat, deliberately avoiding Derek's venomous gaze in the rearview mirror. Derek's voice cut through the silence, low and sharp. You think you've won, kid? Derek growled. You don't know how this works. I've been on the force for over a decade. I've got friends in places you can't even imagine. Daniels didn't respond, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Derek leaned forward as far as his restraints would allow, his voice dripping with malice. That woman out there? She's finished. You think her little act of defiance is going to hold up against the department? Against me? We'll bury her, just like we've buried everyone else. Daniels turned, his expression cold and unreadable. Shut up, he said quietly. But Derek's smirk only widened. Back at the park, Holloway was speaking into his radio, coordinating backup to process the scene, while Layla crouched down to speak to her children. Amara clung to her mother, her small body trembling as she buried her face in Layla's shoulder. Jalen, however, stood stiffly, his hands balled into fists at his sides. His jaw was set, and his eyes burned with a mix of fear and defiance. Jalen, Layla said softly, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. It's over now. You were so brave tonight, but you don't need to carry this anymore. Let me handle it. Jalen's gaze didn't waver. You can't let him get away with it, Mama, he said firmly. You can't let him hurt anyone else. Layla felt a lump rise in her throat as she nodded. I won't, she promised. I swear to you, he'll never hurt another person. As Daniels pulled into the station parking lot, Derek's demeanor shifted. His fury gave way to something darker, calculated, manipulative. He leaned back in his seat, his expression calm now, almost smug. You don't get it, do you? Derek said as Daniels opened the car door to escort him inside. "This isn't going to go the way you think. You're not a hero, Daniels. You're just a kid in over your head." Daniels ignored him, tightening his grip on Derek's arm as he led him toward the building. But Derek wasn't done. "When this blows over and you're going to wish you hadn't picked a side. Because people like me. We don't go down easy. And people like her." He laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "She's just another target." Daniels paused, his jaw clenching as he fought the urge to respond. Instead, he pushed Derek through the station doors, where 2 officers were waiting to process him. Derek's smirk lingered as he was led away, his words hanging in the air like a poison cloud. Meanwhile, Layla and her children had been taken to a separate area to give their statements. As she spoke, recounting the night's events with the same precision and clarity she used on the Senate floor, her resolve only hardened. This wasn't just about holding Derek White accountable. It was about sending a message to him, to his allies, and to every corrupt system that allowed people like him to thrive. Holloway listened closely, his pen moving steadily across his notepad. When she finished, he looked up, his expression thoughtful. "You've got a strong case," he said. "The audio recording, the witnesses, it's all in your favor. But you need to be prepared for the blowback. White's not just some hot-headed cop. He's got people on his side. People who will go to great lengths to protect him." Lila met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "I've been fighting people like him my whole life," she said. "I'm not stopping now." Holloway nodded slowly. "Good, because you're going to need that fight." As the hours wore on, the full scope of Derek White's actions began to come to light. The audio recording wasn't the only evidence against him. Daniels, emboldened by Layla's courage, came forward with his own testimony, revealing years of misconduct and corruption within the department. Other officers, inspired by his bravery, began to speak out as well. By dawn, the story had spread beyond the precinct. The station was buzzing with activity as reporters gathered outside, their cameras and microphones ready to capture the unfolding scandal. Lila watched from a distance, her children by her side. She didn't seek the spotlight, but she knew that this moment was bigger than her. This was about justice, about accountability, and about showing her children and the world that change was possible. Holloway approached her, his expression grim but resolute. "White's not going to walk away from this," he said. "But this is just the beginning. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, and it's going to get messy." "I'm ready," Lila replied. "We've been living with this mess for far too long. It's time to clean it up." Holloway gave a small nod of respect. "Good luck," he said. "You're going to need it." Lila turned to Jalen and Amara, her heart swelling with pride as she looked at their faces. They had been through so much, but they were strong. Stronger than she could have ever imagined. "We did it, Mama," Jalen said quietly. "We stopped him." Lila smiled, pulling her children into a tight embrace. "We did," she said, "but the fight's not over. It's just beginning." And as the sun rose over the city, casting its golden light on the chaos below, Layla knew that she was ready. For her children, for her community, and for every person who had ever been silenced by fear, she would keep fighting. And this time she wouldn't stop until the system itself was brought to its knees. The first rays of dawn filtered through the cracks in the blinds of the precinct's waiting area, casting streaks of golden light across the worn linoleum floor. Layla Carter sat on a stiff plastic chair, her children asleep against her shoulders, their small bodies draped across her lap in quiet exhaustion. The events of the night had left a heavy mark on all of them, but for the first time since the confrontation with Derek White, Layla felt a flicker of hope. The battle wasn't over, but she had struck a blow in a war she had been fighting her entire life. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Sergeant Holloway appeared in the doorway, his expression a mix of exhaustion and resolve. He held a folder in his hands, the edges of the papers inside frayed from hours of being thumbed through. "We've got him, ma'am," Holloway said, his voice low but steady. "White's been booked. Assault, harassment, resisting arrest. And with Daniel's testimony and the audio recording, there's a solid case against him." Lila exhaled deeply, relief washing over her like a wave. She glanced down at her children, still fast asleep, their faces peaceful despite everything they had endured. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said quietly. "But this isn't just about him. You know that." Holloway nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "I do," he said. "White isn't the first, and he won't be the last. Men like him thrive in systems that protect them. But this is a start." Layla studied him for a moment. There was sincerity in his words, a genuine desire to see change. She could see it in the way his shoulders sagged with the weight of years spent navigating a broken system. But sincerity wasn't enough. Change required more than good intentions, it required action. "What happens now?" she asked. Holloway hesitated, his eyes flicking to the folder in his hands. "There's going to be fallout," he admitted. "White's got friends in the department, higher-ups who do everything they can to downplay this. And with you being who you are..." He trailed off, his meaning clear. Layla gave a small, bitter smile. "They'll try to make this about me," she finished for him. "Paint me as the angry black woman overstepping her bounds. They've done it before." Holloway didn't deny it. "They'll push back hard," he said. "But you've got something they don't, a platform. People are going to listen to you." Lila's smile faded as her mind shifted to strategy. She couldn't afford to rely on the court of public opinion alone. Her position as a senator gave her a voice, but it also made her a target. She needed to ensure that the evidence against White and his allies was airtight, that the truth was so undeniable it couldn't be swept under the rug. "I want the names," she said, her tone sharp and determined. "Every officer, every superior who covered for him. I want them all." Holloway hesitated again, then slid the folder across the table to her. "They're all in there," he said. "White isn't the only one who needs to answer for this." Lila opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages filled with reports, complaints, and testimonies. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Derek White was just the tip of the iceberg. "This isn't just about one bad cop," she said, more to herself than to Holloway. "This is a network, a culture." Holloway nodded grimly. "And it's been rotting from the inside for decades. But with this, you've got a chance to tear it apart." Hours later, Layla and her children finally left the precinct, stepping out into the morning sun. The air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the previous night. Reporters had begun to gather near the steps of the building, their cameras trained on the exit. Lila stopped, taking a deep breath as she prepared to face the questions she knew would come. But before she could step forward, Jalen tugged at her hand. "Mama," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "Do we have to talk to them?" Lila knelt down, brushing a hand gently over his curls. "Not if you don't want to," she said softly. "But we need people to know what happened, so it doesn't happen again." Jalen hesitated, his small face scrunching in thought. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said, "but only if they listen." "They'll listen," Layla promised, her voice firm. "And if they don't, we'll make them." With that, she rose to her feet, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the crowd. The reporters surged forward, shouting questions, their voices blending into a cacophony of sound. Lila raised a hand, silencing them with a single gesture. "What happened last night?" she began, her voice clear and steady. is not an isolated incident. It is the result of a system that has failed to hold itself accountable, a system that has allowed men like Derek White to act without consequence for far too long. The crowd quieted as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of someone who had lived the reality of what she was describing. But last night wasn't just about my family, she continued. It was about every family that has been silenced, every victim who has been ignored. It was about justice. And justice will not be denied. The reporters erupted into questions again, but Layla held up her hand once more. I'll answer your questions, she said. But first, I need you to hear me. This fight isn't just mine. It's all of ours. And it's not over. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Layla sat in her living room with Amara and Jalan curled up beside her. The events of the day had left her drained, but the fire inside her burned brighter than ever. The folder Holloway had given her sat on the coffee table, its contents spread out in front of her. She picked up a photograph of Derek White, his smirking face staring back at her. For a moment she felt a surge of anger, but she pushed it aside. Anger wasn't enough. She needed action. Jalan shifted beside her, his small hand resting on hers. Mama, he said softly, are the bad guys gone now? Layla looked down at him, her heart aching at the innocence in his question. Not all of them, she admitted. But we've started something. And we're going to finish it. Jalan nodded, his face serious. Can I help? Layla smiled, brushing a kiss against his forehead. You already have, she said. More than you know. As she sat there, surrounded by the evidence of a system that had long since failed its people, Layla felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready. For her children, for her community, and for every voice that had been silenced, she would fight. And this time she wouldn't stop until the walls of injustice came crashing down.